and told Simon about two things. To slow a bit down, he is a very, very speedy speaker, and I said to him about the tie, but perhaps you can tell a bit about.
I'll tell the story. Thank you. Being English, I'm very tight and officious, and I came to visit Raw's practice in 2005, and being English was wearing a tie. In fact, I feel naked before you. I'm told when you speak, you should imagine the audience naked. I've now given you an image that you didn't need. So I was observing Raw's consultations, and I recommend observing consultations in a language you don't understand, because you get to watch the body language and hear the intonation, and you see the expertise of a true professional through different eyes. But a point came when Raw started to laugh, and his patient laughed, and then they started to cry with their laughter. And then Raw told me that his patient was very sorry for my loss. Because I was wearing a tie, he assumed I was going to a funeral. So, thank you for inviting me here today. I will try to speak in European English. I'm humbled that you've invited me, but also humbled that you can probably, I hope, understand what I'm saying, but that I don't speak Danish, for which I can only apologize. I bring to you a story of what we're doing in England. I do not suggest that we know things that you don't. Indeed, my thesis was looking at training in Denmark, and I have learnt much from you. So I share with you experiences, but do not claim that they are new, or we have an English phrase, teaching grandmother to suck eggs. I have no idea what it means, but I'm not trying to teach you things that you probably already know. So over the next few minutes, I would like to talk about why we have a recruitment problem in England. I nearly said the word crisis, but I'd be in terrible trouble if that word reached Twitter, because our politicians get very upset about words like that. About a deal that we have launched to try and improve things for general practice, how I'm trying to improve recruitment to GP training, other elements of maximizing the workforce. And also, I will then finish with how I think it is for us to encourage young doctors to make positive career choices for general practice, which is the best job in medicine. And sometimes we forget to articulate that. So looking first at the background and causes. That's getting in the way, sorry. If we look at this slide, this shows workforce trends in England over the 10 years from 2002 to 2012. So the decade, and it is referenced at 0 at 2002. So these aren't, of course, absolute numbers. But I think it's, I'm not sure which point it's here. No, so the top line is the number of hospital consultants. You will see that these rise between 5 and 6% per annum, or per year, every year. Regardless of economic downturn, regardless of any levels of investment, they always increase. More and more specialization in order that you can now see an orthopedic surgeon that specializes in the largest toe of the left foot. We have 4 top lines, 4 bottom lines, and the line that is separate in the middle is GPs. The number of GPs has not kept pace. In England, 93% of patient contacts are in general practice, but when politicians want to be elected, they only ever talk about schools and hospitals. They don't talk about general practice, despite the fact that only 4% of my consultations end up in referrals to hospitals, and only 1% end in admissions. If I increased my referral rate from 4% to 5% because I could not cope with the workload, the hospital workload would go up by 25%. And yet still, they don't recognize how important you are, how important we are. The problem we've had in England is the pull of the big city, and I believe this is true the world over. It occurs in regions towards the regional city, but it most certainly occurs towards London in England. As we have expanded our GP training capacity across the country, the same number of doctors are entering general practice training, but they are being leached from the top of the country to London and the southeast. So gradually the number of general practice trainees at the peripheries of the country are falling, and I believe you have similar experience. I do not quite understand why, that they seem to want to live in London rather than the beautiful countryside, but this is what happens, and I will show some more later. There are also some historical elements. This is only one specialty, it is not general practice, and you don't need to worry about the different blocks, except to say that each is a subsection of my organisation, Health Education England. And each of those geographical areas, we show 3 numbers. The weighted capitation of the population, that is, the population adjusted for deprivation. So trying to have a measure of need. The next column is the percentage of specialists. In this case, it's a medical specialty or hospital specialty, so they're consultants. And the third column is the percentage of trainees. And what you'll see is some areas, such as the northwest at the top, actually not far off balance. Yorkshire and Humber, which is YH, actually in balance. But then we see London, 14% of the population, but 28% of the trainees. That pull is both historical as well as them finding London sexy. This is a map of where doctors are employed. Now, I don't know what metrics or performance indicators you use for mortality. We use 2, one of which is called the Hospital Standardised Mortality Rate. And that has been shown to be directly proportional to the number of doctors. So if you want to improve the health of the population, you actually have sufficient doctors for it. Not something that the funders or commissioners of healthcare necessarily want to hear, because doctors are expensive. But you'll see here, London has 452 doctors per 100,000 population, whereas the area that I'm responsible for, which is the middle of the country, and east of England, where I've been for the last few years, 248. Scotland is a bit of an anomaly because it is so rural that it does actually need more doctors to serve a smaller population, so don't draw any conclusions about the Scots, much as I'd like to. Our next problem is our media, and I apologise, I've forgotten the name of your trade union chairman already, but I was talking to him this morning and saying that as I was reading my newspaper on my iPad, the headline in the top national newspaper, the Times of London, is an anti-GP story today. And we regularly see headlines criticising GPs, often for things that are not even their responsibility. And we even have one of our national newspapers actually asking readers to submit negative stories about general practice. We actually contribute to it as well, though, because I don't know what it's like in Denmark, but in the UK we have so many different GP organisations that oppose each other more often than work together. And the problem with that is that the other specialties have learned to work together. So they go in and see ministers, funders, and even journalists and speak with one voice. I was once in a meeting with our Department of Health. There were 8 GP organisations. And I said to the civil servant, how do you get a voice from general practice? And he said, no, that's the wonderful thing. We don't need to, because we'll always get one of you to say what we want. And our biggest problem, I feel, is that we have too many GP organisations fighting each other. And we need to learn the art of compromise. But we also need to learn to say something positive about ourselves. So I asked a group of medical students and foundation doctors why they weren't applying for general practice. And they said, but you all hate it, so why would we want to do it? And our problem is that we are overloaded. Our workload is too great, our bureaucracy is too great, and we are getting exhausted. But the solutions to that, as well as addressing things such as the bureaucracy, are actually to get sufficient workforce. And you don't get sufficient workforce by telling them it's a horrible job. You get a sufficient workforce by giving an authentic story of why it's truly fabulous to be a GP and planning for the future. So one of the things we've done is develop a new deal for general practice, and this is called the 10-point plan, and it is available on the net, and if any of you are having trouble sleeping, feel free to download it. There are 10 points, and I'm not going to cover all 10, I'm just going to pick a couple out. But the 10 points are around recruiting more, keeping the current workforce, and also enabling people to return. And if I give you an example under each, so recruiting more, we have some campaigns to try and promote general practice. These have been very interesting because we've used social media experts to aim at the people that we want to recruit. And what's very clear is that we fall into two populations of digital immigrants and digital natives. And apparently the cutoff is if you're born before or after 1983. And if you're born before 1983, you just don't get the campaign. It just turns you off. But if you're born after 1983, you don't understand why people don't get it. So it's been very interesting. And I think historically we've marketed to ourselves rather than to the people we need to engage with. But we're doing things to try and make training more attractive and trying to target the areas that need it. And I will cover some of those things in future slides. Retaining people is very interesting. There's two things. Firstly, people are retiring early. One reason is a desire to improve their work-life balance and the concerns about the bureaucracy. But the other is what's happening to our pensions and the taxation of pensions, and that actually people are thinking, I'm better off retired than working. And that's a problem for the public. But the other is that gradually medicine in the UK has become much more of a multiplicity of workforce, many more female GPs. I don't like the term feminization of the workforce, which is very common in the UK. I think that means that I'm going to develop breasts. But I think we should value the diversity of our workforce. But we know that many GPs that are women take time off to have their families and then find it's hard to return to practice. If we are truly valuing those as members of our workforce, as peers in our profession, we need to make it possible to carry on practicing. I suspect with the society you have, you're better at that than we are, but we've got a long way to go. And then return to practice. We have brought in so much regulation around GPs and so many hoops that they have to jump through to maintain their practice that many have found it very hard after career breaks to get back in. So we've put in incentives to help them. So looking at improving the recruitment, we're doing a number of things. We found that doctors don't like applying once a year. For years, medical recruitment in the UK was throughout the year. As we got enough doctors, we moved to once a year. We're now reversing that. I've talked about the marketing campaign, but the other thing we're doing is realizing that somebody of my age going to talk to people in their early 20s and telling them how fabulous the job is doesn't really work. My daughter said, "Look, Dad, you're just in God's waiting room. Why are you going to..." I love her, I'm not sure. Near peers are absolutely vital. People that are in their training or have just completed their training have a much more authentic message. But then we're looking at other options. So for example, a lot of doctors in the UK like to go to Australia or New Zealand for a couple of years. Largely they do that at certain waypoints in their training. And the trouble is, some of them then find they like it and they don't come back. But we make it hard for them to come back because currently they can't apply for training from Australia, or they can't get a job in the UK and then take a year out. So what we're saying is, we want you so much, apply and we'll guarantee you your place. So we're trying a number of different things. The other thing we found is that a lot of doctors just aren't capable of entering GP training, especially if they've trained abroad, because they don't have a concept, mainly outside the European Union actually, but they don't have a concept of what general practice is. So many of those then struggle if they get into training. So we're now giving them a pre-GP year, a bit like your 6 months. but targeted at those that need a cultural induction. And in particular, we are putting incentives to prioritize the areas that aren't getting enough GPs. So then we've looked at our own processes to say, can we appoint more? Because it's felt that perhaps we're excluding people from the start of training when they might be capable with a bit more supportive training. But the difficult balancing act there is not lowering the standards and not putting patients at risk. We're also working with, our government has a team called the Behavioural Insights team, and they're working on a thing called nudge technology. And what they're working on is a means of encouraging people to do things. So for example, we have, you may have the same, but our military have a reserves military as well, that are people in other jobs that work for them some of the time. And what they've found is when people go through the selection process, many drop out. But just getting a phone call and then a text from an officer saying, glad you came, might you consider signing up, massively increases the response rate. So it's those sorts of things. The other thing we're doing is gradually reducing training in other specialties. We train an excess of respiratory physicians, and I could go through no end of other specialties. So we need to get more of a balance. So then, I'm conscious of time, so I'd like to move on to another thing we want to do is maximising the primary care workforce. We often talk about general practice as though it's just GPs. Now, we need to remember, and apologies if this needs any, I suspect you will get it, but if not, Roy will translate. But I believe that GP is a unique job. We handle uncertainty. We also deal with patients with complex multi-system disease in their context. There is no other specialty that does that. But equally, I would suggest that we spend much of our time doing things that don't need to be us doing them. The problem is, if we stop doing those things, our workload just gets worse. So when I started as a GP, patients used to come with 1, 2, very occasionally 3 problems, but also I'd see a really complex patient and then I'd see someone with something really minor. Now the people with, sorry, minor's probably a bit pejorative, but the minor things go to the nurses, and I just see complex patient after complex patient after complex patient. And I don't know if you have a word, but we say at the end of the day, I'm knackered. Yeah, worn out. So if we get a further workforce, we do also need to change the GP job alongside that. And I say we need headspace, time to think, and I would actually say we need longer consultations. I consult on a Saturday more often, and I do consultations that are 15 minutes rather than 10, which is the typical length in the UK. And I find my patients need to come back much less often. Just that little bit extra time enabled us to deal with their agenda. So this is the report, and again, this is downloadable from the net, and indeed I can provide a PDF to the organiser if you wish. It was an independent commission that we commissioned from Professor Martin Rowland, who is Professor of Health Services Research in Cambridge. And it has a number of key messages. Much of it was about how we work. Much of it, actually, quite a few of the ideas were from Denmark. Many things that I saw in practices in Denmark are in that report. Many, if not all of you, will have regular, routine telephone consultations with your patient and email consultations with your patients. I'm regarded as a pariah at home because I have email consultations with my patients. So we've got a way to go. So a number of elements in there. We want to look particularly at the nursing workforce. We have very well-developed nurses. We now have a career framework for those nurses. And certainly if a patient comes to my practice, say with diabetes or with asthma, they will get much better care from the nurses than they would from me. I would never start somebody on insulin. I would send them to the nurse, who will do a much better job and leave me to do the other work. But also we're looking at more pharmacists in practice. Now, historically in the UK, pharmacists have been sent in by the funders to tell us naughty GPs that we're prescribing expensive drugs when we could be prescribing cheaper ones. What we're now looking at, though, is actually people live with multiple comorbidities, don't they? They live with multiple conditions. A person with diabetes will also have hypertension, ischemic heart disease, so on and so forth. The pharmacists are much better at managing the interactions of those drugs and avoiding the harm that we often cause. And then we're looking at physician's associates, or you may know the term physician's assistants, which is the American term. The use of paramedics in practice. The thing that stresses me most when I'm duty doctor in my practice is having 30 people yet to see and knowing that there are 2 patients that are very unwell waiting for me to dash out to their home to see them. Equally, I think sometimes I admit them to hospital because I know I can't get back to review them in a reasonable time. So the idea is that could I send a paramedic out? I'll still go and do the routine visiting, still go and do the end-of-life care visiting and such like, but could the urgent visiting be done by them? Or if I've seen someone, could I say to the paramedic, please could you visit them in an hour and check on them again? It could have benefits for all. But then also looking at people that might do more of the administration for us. And a number of things around education and training. In particular, we're looking at training hubs to try and train the workforce for primary care, for general practice, in general practice. How often is it people that are trained in hospitals that then land in general practice? How much do we train health and social care together and have joint solutions? So many of the things around that. And then finally, I'd like to talk just a little bit about positive career choices and include that. How do we get to those peripheries of the UK, the remote and rural areas? As I've said, the first thing I think is that we need to be talking about general practice as a dynamic specialty. I think it's a great privilege to be with patients in the deep and darkest moments of their lives. I have yet to ever go on holiday anywhere in the world without bumping into a patient. My daughters hate it, but to me it's a great privilege. I've been with, in fact, I remember, and this is a reflection of a failure on my part really, but I remember a teenage girl coming to me with an unplanned pregnancy and saying, my mother's going to kill me. She will feel I've brought such great shame on the family. I knew that her mother had done it when it was her. But she didn't. No, I had to be careful how I handled that. But I was able to say, do you know what? I think your mum will understand. We need inspirational GPs as inspirational role models. The young medical students and doctors need to look at you and think, that's what I aspire to be. Not to see, that amused someone. Clearly I'm not what they aspire to be. But we need positive role models. We do need to market general practice. Now we do need to do that authentically. I keep using that word. Let's not try and pretend it's something that it isn't. I was going to use a very rude phrase from England then, but I've changed my mind. We have a campaign, Nothing General, about general practice. That does not mean that we're not generalists. What it's saying is that it is unique and every experience is unique. And we now have a group of GPs that have formed their own website called YGP, where they decided they wanted to have some positive messages. We need positive career choices. What I noticed when I first came to Denmark in 2005 is much more of a balance of messages. But in the UK, my professor of general practice actually said to me, why on earth do you want to be a GP? You're too bright to be a GP. I reminded her of that a few years later. But regularly we hear of medical students that are told, why are you giving up medicine? Or a dean of a medical school in England last year said to his medical students, well done on getting here, you need to work hard, play hard, but make sure you always work hard, not just play hard, because 50% of you are going to end up as GPs and you don't want to be in that group. So we're working very hard with our medical schools. Now, medical schools have been fabulous on it actually, and we are co-sponsoring a working group looking at the positive models. But equally, we know that school people ask to spend time in a general practice to understand what it's like, and the practices say, no, we're too busy. The hospitals say, yes. We have got to help. So we're looking at these things such as tasters, but we need to give better career choice information, better guidance. Many people don't actually understand the job. I've had a foundation doctor sitting in with me in my practice, and at the end of the first morning he said, My God, I had no idea what you did. I thought it was all coughs and colds. I've seen more patient morbidity in one morning than I saw in a whole month in hospital medicine. Now, to be fair, he happened to be on the day with my patient with a pheochromocytoma. But it's still an important message. And then I think we've really got to start giving positive messages about the locations, about the rural areas. And that's one thing I hope I'll learn from you as well. But I've been going to meetings with, say, Australian health recruiters, and I'll give you some ideas from that. But look at these house prices and look at the incomes of doctors. If we look at a trainee salary of £30,000 to £47,000, why would you want to live in London where a house is £300,000 when you could live in the northeast where it's £120,000? So there's something that needs to be done there. But equally, how about putting up the doctor in the home of somebody that lives in the area? That's what they do in the Northern Territories of Australia. We're looking at that in our rural areas now. Many of the doctors that go to our rural areas have qualified in India or Africa or whatever. They have no local family. They have no understanding of the culture. If they can assimilate and learn to love the population they're serving, then I think they're more likely to stay. But also it may be economically advantageous for both parties. And then I finish with the quotes from the YGP website. And these were the ones that I liked. I'm sure there would be others there. But just think for a moment, if you were to try and sum up in one sentence why being a GP is so special. If you were in an elevator with a medical student going up in Tower 1 or 2 later today and they said, "Why are you a GP?" what will you say? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. And I think you really gave us some inspiration. So at least when we a bit later go for coffee breaks, you will see around 200 bright role models going to coffee. I think we'll have some minutes for direct questions to Simon. And then we'll switch into Danish later. But please give your questions to Simon. There are 3 medical students that run around with microphones. There's a question. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Gunvar Lillevang. I am doing some research in Denmark about why people choose this specialty. And we find that an important factor is how they are introduced to the specialty in medical school. And in some of our medical schools, they are almost not introduced to this specialty. In Copenhagen, they are 8 days in a GP practice in 6 years. So my question to you is, how much time in the specialty do you have in your undergraduate training?
Thank you. It's very varied. There was a paper in the British Journal of General Practice a few months ago from the University of Exeter that showed that over the last 10 years, the number of academic departments of general practice has dropped massively, and the time in general practice has fallen. Equally, in some of the medical schools, they may go to general practice, but they're not actually exposed to general practice. They go there for their consultation skills training, because somebody has decided that that's what GPs are good at, or if I were to be cynical, that's all GPs are good for. And I think they need an immersion in general practice. Our recruitment rate from medical schools varies from 11% to 52%. The 52% is Kiel, University of Kiel, which is in the sort of northwest part of the UK, where they have a completely immersed program where much of their program is in general practice. The lowest is a couple of weeks. That is why we've appointed a lady called Professor Valois, who was the Dean of Kiel, to chair a group co-sponsored by myself and Professor Ian Cameron, who chairs the Medical Schools Council, to come up with new proposals. It is just what you say. It's not just the number of weeks, though. It's also the quality of the practices and the quality of that exposure. They need to be given time, and to give time, there needs to be adequate resourcing, because patients still need to be seen, practices still need to be run. So they need good educators that were recruited against good criteria, so you know that they're going to the best of practices and are good at their education. They need people that are sparky and really love general practice. And then they need sufficient time. And we've also found from our work that they need an opportunity to get to know the patients. And one of the things that really works is being given an opportunity to run a case study with a particular patient or family and get to know their problems and where general practice helps them. So I think your research is spot on. It would fit very much with the research in the UK as well.
Thank you. More questions to Simon? Yes, there's a question over here.
What about trust? Trust between the politicians and the GPs. Are you working on that? How is it in UK to talk between the politicians and the GPs? In Denmark, it's catastrophic right now.
I feel like I could lose my job just by answering it, but my father once said to me, "How do you know a politician's lying? Their lips are moving." But if I was to be slightly less cynical, I think one of the problems is that we have two different value sets, and neither is necessarily right or wrong. I only discovered this recently. Somebody said to me when I was really bothered by the way the politicians would decide this decision, and she said, "Why do you think you're right and they're wrong?" Well, the obvious answer is I'm a doctor. But what she was saying is you have your values base, and you judge everything from that values base. Their judgment is that they believe that democracy is absolute, and that if the public vote for something, that must make it right. And therefore, something that wins votes is right. Now, I don't get that, but apparently they don't get me either. And some of it, I think, is about the difficulty that I've had today is that I don't speak Danish. And I think part of the problem is I don't speak politician, but they don't speak doctor. And historically, we have managed to fight more than work together. And the problem we have now is that we're, certainly in England, we're doing the same ourselves. Social media has turned the profession in on itself. So any doctor who starts to work with the politicians is said to have passed to the dark side.
Yes.
So I think there is a problem of understanding, but I think we need to meet them halfway, and we also need to start respecting our profession and stop vilifying people that are trying.
Yes. And Simon, I have a last question to you. You said that we have to tell the positive stories, and you have launched this Twitter site, YGP, and other social media activities. And we made a survey here in Denmark very recently where we asked medical students and also young trainee doctors that hadn't taken a career choice yet. We asked them, how can we improve recruitment to general practice? And one of the messages they said to us was, stop whining. But have you succeeded in this, both on one side being authentic and also telling the good story of being a DP? Have you stopped whining have the DP stopped whining in UK? As I would see the British Medical Journal, I don't think you quite succeeded in that yet.
I don't think we have, and I confess I'm not sure we ever will, because for as long as I've been a GP, morale has been the lowest it's ever been, and it's only going to get worse. That's how GPs portray it. And actually whining's in the British mentality. I got up and I looked out of my room today and I thought, God, the weather's just as bad here. But would I actually say that? No, because the weather's always bad in England. And in fact, there's a TED Talks about how negative people talk. And the guy that's doing the TED Talk says his mother was so negative. He said, oh, it's the 1st of October. And she said, oh, it's awful, isn't it? And I think there is that problem. And the trouble is, much of the whining is genuine. But I think we need to consider solutions, not just problems. And we need to find ways of articulating it. So what your students said about you're just whining is just the same as our students. They said, you all hate being GPs, why would we want to do it? Well, I don't. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for having chosen general practice, because it gives such a wonderful career opportunity. I am so proud to be a GP, and I'm so proud of my fellow GPs. And I think we need to have the opportunity to say what's wrong and have the opportunity to make it better. But let's also be very proud of the service that we offer to our patients. There's a reason why GPs are still, certainly in the UK, and I hope here, the most respected professionals, well above politicians.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.